I put on mascara before recording this one, which might prove a mistake. We'll see. Hi, hello, how's it going? It's Lo. For my first book of 2023, I read All Boys Aren't Blue, and I bawled my eyes out. So we're gonna talk about it today. This book was very popular on release, but it gained more notoriety as time passed because it keeps getting banned from libraries all over the United States. And you know me, I just love literally everything that makes conservatives angry. I just salivate for it. So Rachel sent me this copy. And guys,
they ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
This is a book that is written for a very specific public in mind, but I think it transcends even that. And because it talks about things that are very much human in us, and especially it explains just how much we need communities to thrive and to grow no matter our walks. There is just so much to talk about in this book. So first, I'm going to go for a couple of main topics.
Hi, this is AREN. As a majority of you know, I speak Portuguese as my mother tongue, and I'm not sure if many of you actually know this, but Portuguese is a very heavily gendered language, which means that I have a lot of difficulties with the singular they. Throughout the video, I tried to catch myself and to really speak the singular they as it was supposed to be, but sometimes it slipped. And so I promised to make an effort to learn the language better because English is my second language, and as I said, I've taught myself it. I promised to make an effort, but just so you know, George Johnson uses they/them pronouns, singular they, and my background is no excuse for the slips that I made. So I just want to put that out as a little bit of accountability. Moving on.
The first one is going to be my general impressions of the book. Then we are going to look at how this book is just a great example of gender as an identity and gender as performative. So we're looking a little into queer theory today. I hope that, I know that this isn't what you guys wanted walking into this video, but this is a great book to explain queer theory too. So everyone is fucked with me today. I'm going to be talking a lot. Then we're going to look at how he is able to exemplify so well the inherent vulnerability of existing as a human. Then we're going to look into how he uses grief as a political tool to humanize people who are dehumanized constantly in society. And finally, we're going to look at why does this book keep getting banned and what does it mean for people, queer people of color, that it keeps getting banned. So first things first, I'm going to take off the dust jacket because I hate dust jackets. I detest dust jackets. I don't know why Americans keep putting dust jackets over every hard fucking cover book that ever existed. But anyway, that being out of the way, we're going to look at my general impressions of the book. I have a problem with most LGBTQ memoirs because it always focuses on a sort of individual sense of overcoming difficulty. Almost like I was this queer little boy in the closet and I went through this and I went through that, but I overcame and now I'm happy and I. One of the things that I find difficult with memoirs is that they tend to be self-centered, and especially if they're white, and white queers are not exempt from this. So every LGBTQ plus memoir that I've read so far was always filled with this sense of self-absorption from the person who was telling the story, no matter how touching the story was. But this book is the opposite of that. This book is the story of George, but it's also the story of the people who made George be who he is, his community. He calls it his village. And he puts those people all the time front and center in his narrative. And I really appreciate it because it shows that we are not individual people individually suffering with our own issues. We are a community. We are a commonality of people. Our issues are not experienced alone. Our issues and our problems are always lived in community. We're going to talk about it in a bit, but I just really want to highlight that this is very much a book about community, a book about love and how community and love nurturing you are necessary parts for you to grow and thrive. It shows that you're not just your own person, you're also a collection of all of the people who influenced you through your life. The writing is a little on the younger side for me, I would say, but this is a YA memoir, so you know. You don't get into the rain and expect not to get wet. But as I've said before, whenever we're an older person, like older, I mean, my hair is not looking good today. Whenever we're an older person, and older, I mean older than the target demographic of this book, we need to analyze this book not for the outward themes, but for the underlying themes. And this book has underlying themes galore, so we're going to look through to all of that. This is a book that features race very heavily, and if needed be, I can make a second video only making an analysis of the intersectionality of this book, but I have a feeling that a lot of people have already discussed this, so I want to talk today about the other things that called my attention while I was reading. So let's begin with gender as performative, because here's the thing. This video is going to use copious amounts of Judith Butler, be thee warned, but I need this book to make a point. Butler says that gender is not a performance as much as it is performative. Ergo, gender produces a series of effects. We all exist in ways that will consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. It's in the way that we exist, that we walk, the way that we talk, the way that we navigate through the world. Everything that we'll do, the way that we present ourselves, the way that we present ourselves to the others, the way that we dress, everything will consolidate an idea and an impression of being a man or being a woman. So gender is performative because it's a thing that you do. You're always consolidating this impression. But this impression will also impact you on who you are and how you interact with the world. So we have this series of norms around gender who say women act like this and men act like this, and as we go around our lives, they will determine if people will see us as women, if people will see us as men, or if people will be confused and not able to categorize us. And the perceived deviation from this category, when people think that you're deviating from those binary categories, that's perceived as a deviation from the norm, and that it's punished. And the punishment can come from institutional powers such as school or medicine, but it can also come from uninstitutional powers like the family or like bullying. And this book is just so ripe with examples of this moment where this body is not conformed to one consolidation. People can't consolidate this body as a man or a woman, and so this body is punished for violating the gender binary. Example. Let's take a look at page 54. I was very sassy as a kid. A sissy is what the kids used to call me back then, before they got older and escalated to the word fat. I remember I used to watch the way women would walk with the switch, that movement of the hips going side to side as you walk forward. I had a natural switch, but I knew I wasn't supposed to walk like that, so I tried my best not to. Emphasis on tried. I was skinny and for sure didn't have any hips. But back then, before other kids got cruel, I would try my best to throw my little body from side to side when I walked, even more than my natural walk was already doing. My family always said, "Stop switching, Matt." But I would just laugh, even when someone told me to stop doing and go back to walking like a little boy. That is so relevant. When you say, go back to walking like a little boy, those are moments where this body of this child is being conformed to this preconceived ideas of gender, of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. But this also highlights just how gender as performative works, because that impresses and causes harm and causes an impression, and it changes fundamentally the person where this line and this punishment is directed to. So if I say to a little kid, stop doing this, walk like a boy, I am causing a harm on that kid. I'm causing an impression, and I'm fundamentally changing that kid, because that kid will be like, well, the way that my body does this is wrong. I have to act in a certain way. And this is what Butler means when she says that gender is performative, because it produces a series of effects, but at the same time that it's something that exists from you to the outside world, it's also something from the outside world that exists to you. That is the basis of Butler's queer theory, by the way. It took me so much time to understand that. So this book for me is a great example of what gender as performative or gender performativity is. And I'm going to start using it with my students in class, because I feel like this explains so well the concept of gender is a constant doing, is something that you consistently do all the time, something that your gender is not really done, it's never really ended, it's never really finished. Your gender is always a work in progress. And if you change a little bit about the ways in which you look, the ways that you act, the ways that you dress, then that consolidate other impressions. And that is a huge place for subversion as well. This is where drag queens will come in, because it's not a parody. It's like a subversion of those consolidating norms of what being a man and being a woman is, in a way that is transgressive inherently. However, that is not just it, because I've talked a lot in this channel about gender as an analytical category, meaning the ways in which you can analyze how gender works and the purpose of gender in society, and gender as a personal identity, which is what you identify as. And I've always said, oh, this is something that you can't question. If someone says, I am X gender, then you accept that person. That is correct. That doesn't mean that we can theorize about it, though. And Butler is one of the people who actually does some amazing theories of gender as an identity. And one of the main things that she says, and this is what I wanted to explain here, because I think that this is so beautiful. She says that gender is not necessarily something that we possess or something that we are, but rather ways of being undone. What does this mean? Here's the most beautiful thing that I think was ever written about gender, and this is on Judith Butler's Undoing Gender. Let's face it, we're undone by each other, and if we're not, we're missing something. If this seems so clearly the case with grief, it is only because it was already the case with desire. One does not always stay intact. It may be that one wants to or does, but it may also be that despite one's best efforts, one is undone in the face of the other by the touch, by the scent, by the feel, by the prospect of the touch, by the memory of the feel. And so when we speak about my sexuality or my gender as we do and as we must, we mean something complicated by it. Neither of these is precisely a possession, but both are to be understood as modes of being dispossessed, ways of being for another, or indeed by virtue of another. What the fuck have I just read? Judith Butler is basically arguing that gender and sexuality is not something that you are, but rather describes a way that you are affected by other people. And I really like this part. There's this specific part here that I really like when she says the prospect of the touch. Because when you get flustered and you get butterflies, you understand how other people have an effect on you. And so when other people are like threatening, think about a romance book, right? That moment of loaded tension before the touch actually happens, with the butterflies in the stomach, and you're like, this person could do pretty much whatever they wanted right now, and I would let them. And realizing the vulnerability that you have before that person. Gender is a way to be vulnerable to other people, and sexuality is a way to be vulnerable to other people, is the ways in which you will come undone. And I think that that is so beautiful, and such a beautiful way to think, because it's not a personal identity in the sense that this is something that I am, and this is something that I can tell other people how to be. And I think that this is very interesting because we're seeing a rise in almost like purity politics within LGBTQ plus communities, almost like, oh, you have to be this in order to be a lesbian. You have to be this in order to be trans. And that sense of purity is not, it's wrong, because gender is not necessarily an identity, a banner, a flag. Gender is a way that exists for you to be vulnerable before other people. So gender and sexuality, rather than explaining who you are as a person, will explain which touches will make you vulnerable, which words will make you vulnerable. And that is beautiful in the sense that, remember that one work of art by Marina Abramović, where she's like holding this arrow to her heart? A gender is almost like that. It's almost like the arrow to your heart. It can give you a lot of pleasure, but it can also give you a lot of pain. So gender and sexuality are not necessarily identities. They are ways of being, as Butler says, dispossessed, put beside oneself, like ways in which that arrow can pierce through your heart and you would let it, and maybe you would also love it. And so when you look at gender and sexuality like this, and this walks into my third point, and I swear I have a point to make about the book here, is that gender and sexuality are proofs that we are incredibly vulnerable as people, that we can consistently be threatened by the ways in which we interact with the world. We can be threatened to be undone. And this can be a good unmaking, this can be a good undoing, like being touched lovingly, being held lovingly. All of those things that you think are surreal, like, and he talks about it in this book a lot, like how difficult it was to accept affection within relationships outside of his family, because he was so, it was so vulnerable. It was a level of vulnerability that he was not ready for. To be loved is to be vulnerable. And if gender is going to explain the ways in which you will be vulnerable to other people, it would also expose you to several ways in which other people can hurt you. He's also very clear about this in the book. The part where he talks about losing his virginity, it's very explicit that his sexuality in that moment is not only something that can unmake him by giving him lots of pleasure, but also something that can unmake him, as it does throughout the book, by bringing him lots of grief. But also, it can only be the case of gender and sexuality, because before gender and sexuality, we are already vulnerable as people. To be human is to be vulnerable. We consistently need other people around us that we may not even know to recognize us as humans who are worthy of protection and worthy of respect. And so our very existence, when we're born, we're extremely vulnerable, and we consistently depend on other people to survive. And this takes me to the point that I wanted to make, which is the point about community. There's this one part in Undoing Gender where Butler says the following: the condition of being laid bare from the start, depending on those we do not know, is one with which we cannot precisely argue. We come into the world unknowing and dependent, and to a certain degree, we remain that way. We can try, from the point of view of autonomy, to argue with this situation, but we are perhaps foolish, if not dangerous, when we do. Of course, we can say that for some, this primary scene is extraordinary, loving, and receptive, a warm tissue of relations that support and nurture life in its infancy. For others, this is, however, a scene of abandonment or violence or starvation, their bodies given over to nothing, or to brutality, or to no sustenance. No matter what the valence of the scene is, however, the fact remains that infancy constitutes a necessary dependency, one that we never leave fully behind. And so, on one hand, this vulnerability that exists for us as humans, and that is, exists within gender and sexuality, as we're talking about gender identities, this is a vulnerability that allows for you to be nourished and cared for, and also allows for terrible violence. But this is the center of what we will call community, because community is precisely this, is recognizing that you are dependent on other people to survive, and that other people are dependent on you, and that you cannot live on your own, because there is no such thing as being human and existing on your own. You're always dependent on other people for survival. And I think that this is what is very highlighted in this book, this fundamental vulnerability. He talks about the vulnerability of being gay and being black and being queer. He talks about that vulnerability, but there is something below, there is something before. There is the inherent vulnerability of being human, of recognizing that you are what you are because of other people, and that you absolutely need those people to nourish you until you can nourish them back. And he understands this, that not everyone has access to it. Like in this part, I often think about what it would be like if the world existed with a nanny in each family. Why was my black queer experience one of unconditional love when several others have become the standard of hate and familial violence? Although the national rate of homelessness for the LGBTQAP+ youth is near 40%, the rate in my family has always been 0%. How could one family get so right what the world has gotten so wrong? We should have been the rule, not the exception. They talk a lot about how this community is fundamental for the nourishing of people, for the creation of people. Like they say here, our culture has always found a way to create safety and refuge when there was none. The television show Pose depicts pretty accurately how our culture has survived, Houses within the ballroom culture were formed as places for the LGBTQAP people to go to when they had no home. They had a family structure complete with a house mother whose job was to look out for her kids. And I think that this is so very clear on the fact that in order for us to survive the violence that comes with being LGBTQ+, that means being able to form those communal ties, to form community, to recognize that we need other people to live, that we cannot be free if we are not free in grouping. If other people aren't free with us, then this freedom does not exist. We need other people in order to validate ourselves in our own sexuality, but also to validate that we are vulnerable inherently as people, and we need to have this vulnerability respected so that the prospect of touch, like Butler says, is always a good thing and never the fear of pain and violence. And this is actually the center for when we're thinking about oppression, because here's what Butler says about it. Part of understanding the oppression of lives is precisely to understand that there is no way to argue away this condition of a primary vulnerability, of being given over to the touch of the other, even if, or precisely when, there is no other there, and no support for our lives. To counter oppression requires that one understands that lives are supported and maintained differentially, that there are radically different ways in which human physical vulnerability is distributed across the globe. Certain lives will be highly protected, and the abrogation of their claims to sanctity will be sufficient to mobilize the forces of war. And other lives will not find such fast and furious support, and will not even qualify as grievable. And the question of which lives are grievable is a major point, and this is truly what I wanted to talk about this book, because George Johnson uses grief as a political tool to humanize people who have been dehumanized in society. And I think that that is absolutely brilliant. When you are mourning someone, you are mourning not just the person, you are mourning the part of the person that is gone who recognized you as a human. That person saw you as a human being, worthy of respect and worthy of your lives. And so when that person is gone, it's like a bit of the recognition that made you human is also gone with them. And so it's almost as if truly a piece of you is dying with them. And so you're mourning the person who you were before this recognition was taken away from you. And mourning is only complete, as Judith Butler says, when you understand that grief is to be changed irrevocably. And you don't know exactly the results of this change until it happens. Grief can only happen if you see the person that you're grieving as human. Because grief can only happen if you think that a fellow human, one that recognized you as a person, is gone forever and can no longer offer you that recognition. And so it's almost like one of the people who recognized you as human and therefore made you human is gone forever and can no longer offer you that recognition. So it's a little bit of your humanity dies with that person. So grieving for marginalized people is absolutely revolutionary because it means that you're grieving for them as a fellow human. You're breathing humanity into that person, despite the world saying that that person is less than human, despite the world saying that that person can be subjected to all types of violence, all types of undoing that you wouldn't extend to a fellow human. You're saying that that person can be recognized in those terms, and that is absolutely revolutionary. And all of the moments of grief in this book denote marginalized identities that are always seen as less than. So when they're talking about their Black grandmother, their cousin, their friend, when they're talking about all these people, they're talking about people who are not quite seen as human, whose deaths are not quite seen as grievable, but he is here grieving publicly. He's grieving them publicly because he's saying you can only grieve the death if someone has lived. And in order for you to live, you have to be a human. And I'm grieving this person because this person was a human despite of what society told me, despite of what society said. That person was a human, and I'm grieving them as human because they recognized me as human as well. They say as much at the end, like at this part right here, where they say, as a Black queer person, I've died hundreds of times. Will likely die hundreds more times before my physical death. That is the lesson of death, though. From death comes rebirth. A rebirth in thinking, in processing, in living. Throughout this book, what they're doing is mourning the possibilities of being someone else that wasn't constricted by these norms that exist when we're talking about gender performativity. These norms that try to confine you into these preconceived roles of what being a man and being a woman should do. They're mourning this person that is no longer exists and cannot exist because of what has happened, because of the effects that are produced by gender. And they are doing this consistent mourning throughout the book. So they're recognizing that this little queer boy that they're saying, or this teenager, this confused teenager who inhabited identities that are so often considered ungrievable, so often considered not human or less than human, being Black, being queer, that they were human as well, and that they deserve to be grieved for. So that is one part. But the other part is when they start to grieve for real life people who are so marginalized that they're never grieved properly. What this means, what this shows, is that this is a book mourning for this child who wanted to be something that society was not allowing them to, even though they had a very loving family. And they say this all the time in the book, like, I have an extremely loving family. My family is my rock. My family is my village, is my community. Even still, I have been subjected to things that irrevocably changed me, and I have been subjected to traumas that irrevocably changed me only because I inhabit these marginalized identities, only because I am undone and I am vulnerable in such specific ways that the world around me uses against me, uses as a form of control, as a form of getting me to be in a position where I can be exploited. We're going to talk more about this in a second, but I want to talk about how they start to grieve about real life people. And I'm going to try not to cry here. There is this part where they start to grieve their abuser. And I think that that was so poignant, so beautiful, heartbreaking. Because when you grieve, like all that I said, when you grieve someone, you give them humanity. Grieving your abuser means offering humanity to your abuser. I cannot understand the level of spiritual development, really, that a person has to have in order to achieve this level of being willing to extend humanity to the person that has harmed you so much. And I think that this highlights just the character of the author. The author themselves have really just an amazing character. They're so fair, and they're so willing to forgive. Very few people will be willing to extend humanity to the extent that they did to their abuser like that. And I think that that is absolutely beautiful. But there's the part where they talk about their grandma and oh boy. I am going to make a huge effort not to cry. I don't think that I will be successful. Nanny won't win any awards from GLAAD. She won't have her picture hung up during Black History Month or make any headlines for operating out of a place of love. But because she saw me, I get the chance to tell everyone about her. And maybe, just maybe, an LGBTQAIP person's family members or peers will read these words and enough of her spirit will rub off. Oh God. That part murdered me because it reminded me of my own grandma. And so I started sobbing uncontrollably in the middle of the workday. Yeah. Because this is something that I wrote when my own grandma died. When my own grandma died, I wrote that the city wouldn't stop to mourn her with me. The city wouldn't know or wouldn't remember or wouldn't care about the woman that she was. My grandma, much like George's grandma, was a Black woman who didn't have the opportunity to study, didn't have the opportunity to be. My grandma wasn't the big names of society. She wasn't. She was just yet another poor Black woman living off in Brazil. But she was my grandmother. And whenever we met, we recognized each other. Oh God, I'm gonna cry. Whenever we met, she recognized me as a human. And her recognition was the sweetest. Her recognition was the one that I looked forward to the most. And so it hurts to know that these people, these common people who exist on everyday lives, when they pass, no one will mourn them, despite you, besides you and your family and the people who met them. No one will mourn them with you, despite you losing one of the pillars of who you are. Because when my grandma died, she took with her just a fundamental part of me. And this is much like Butler says, I'm not sure if I'm done grieving, because I'm not sure if the change that needs to happen for me in order for me to stop feeling left adrift, that she's gone, hasn't happened yet. And so I feel like this is so powerful when they mourn publicly people that would not be mourned publicly, because it brings to public light that this was a person who existed, and this was a person that deserved recognition, and this was a person that was responsible for our humanity, and we're breathing humanity and life into them back, especially into people who are considered by society to be ungrievable. Just another death, just another person. They're not. They needed to be as sanctious and as protected and as recognizable as any other life. And in order for that to happen, we need to grieve them publicly. This made me realize that my grieving for my grandmother has a political meaning as well. That by grieving her, I am not letting her humanity die. And by not letting her humanity die, I'm ensuring that she still lives on and that her legacy still lives on. Because she was so special. Much like George's grandmother, she asked no questions. She just loved so fully. And so, I didn't cry that much. I was a sobbing mess reading this book. This part murdered me, especially this part right here, when they talk about how their grandma is sick. And then there is this one part that says the following: and in this moment, I know why this chapter defines the entire book. There will be no book without you. There will be no stories, and I wouldn't have turned out to be this person telling this story if you weren't there to guide my ship, to protect me on my journey from childhood to adolescence, right up to being an adult. Even in your darkest and most fearful time, you told me that your only regret was leaving us behind. If the rest of the world could learn anything from you in this story, is that love is an unconditional thing, that taking care of someone who took care of you is one of the most powerful and transformative things you could do on this earth. Your saving me will allow me, my words, and our story to save others, because at the end of the day, this is all about storytelling. Oh God. Oh shit. Oh fuck. Anyway, this point is, what I want to say is that grieving someone is breathing humanity back into them. And that this can only happen with people who allow us to be who we are, with people who breathe humanity back into us. And so this is a cycle. And we grieve because the cycle is broken, because we can't give each other humanity anymore, because we're consistently breathing humanity into one another. And to do that is truly by storytelling. They're correct in this assessment that it is truly about storytelling, is about telling stories that breathe humanity back into the people who had that humanity stolen from them. And I feel like this is so important. And again, like I said, when we're talking about YA books, as adults, we always have to look at the underlying themes. And the themes of the confusion, the mess, growing up LGBTQ plus, just all of that, there is a feeling of understanding that the people who we are is fundamentally dependent on other people, and that we are consistently recognizing humanity and seeing humanity into each and every one of us, and that by grieving when that cycle is broken, especially when it's broken by police brutality, by LGBTQ plus phobia, by queer phobia, when that cycle is broken unnaturally, then there is a lot of power in grieving. This is why public grieving is so important. And I feel like this is a book that highlights for us really well and teaches us really well how we need to exist in ways in which we can accommodate grief. And we can use this grief for political gains and political means. I don't even know what I'm talking about. This is the second time that I cry in front of the camera. I'm very uncomfortable with that. But the part that they talked about their grandma was just murdered me. I am too weak. I haven't read Inheritance of Orquídea Divina to this day. I bought this book like a little after my grandma died, so a year and a half ago. And I couldn't. I simply couldn't read it because I know that I was going to bawl my eyes out. But anyway, why have I said all this? Because this is why this book keeps getting banned. When you try to humanize people who cannot be humanized, people who are dehumanized, you are met with violence. Because, God forbid, a white kid from the God knows where, Tennessee, sympathizes with a black queer kid. Because that means that that white kid will be much less likely to enact the systems of oppression that allow that black queer kid to be exploited. The system, and here I'm talking about capitalism, needs people that it's going to exploit from. It needs to exploit people in order to survive. And the way that it does this is creating lives that can be exploited because they're less than human. They're less human. And so when you publicly grieve, like George Johnson is doing in this book, like when you publicly grieve for lives that exist as marginalized in order for be exploited, you're thwarting the system. You're stopping the system from running because you're stopping people from actually being willing to put in place those systems of oppression and to enforce those systems of oppression. So this is why this book keeps getting banned, because people in power don't want people sympathizing with each other and don't want people grieving for the ungrievable. They don't want people to breathe humanity into those who are dehumanized. I always keep saying how books are revolutionary, but I think All Boys Aren't Blue highlights that extremely well. It highlights just how profoundly a book can change people, just how profoundly a book can cause change, just by simply inviting someone to grieve with them. They are doing a major work of undoing a lot of prejudice that comes before them, just by inviting them, come here and grieve with me. What they're doing is inviting people and come here and recognize that I am human, that the little boy that I was human, that the teenager that I was human, and all of these people who are considered marginalized in society, all of them are human too. And this is what you're doing when you're grieving with me. So it's not about the sex, it's not about the explicit sins, it's not about that. It's about the fact that people need to perpetuate this system of exclusion. This system of exclusion can only happen and can only take place if you continue to dehumanize people. And grieving these people is an amazing and very easy and very simple way for you to break that cycle. And so I don't think I've read memoirs with this level of sensibility before in my life, and I don't think that I've read memoirs that are this deep. I feel like this book does a lot of the heavy load of giving us stuff to think. And giving us stuff to think about, which are the lives that we're grieving for, and what are we doing when we refuse to grieve someone. Because I see a lot of people going like, oh, you can't make fun of someone when they die. Certain people don't deserve to be grieved as well. And I think that there is a political choice. Instead of not grieving the HIV victims, I am not grieving Ronald Reagan. I want that motherfucker to burn in hell. And I'm making fun of his death because I refuse to extend him the humanity that he himself denied to people who are dying of HIV. There's a political choice in grieving as well, and one that I feel like this book is a great place to start thinking about how can we mobilize grief as a political tool. I'm not even sure if anything that I said makes any fucking sense. Anyway, the only critique that I have on this book is that I did not get the part of the fraternity, but then again, I don't understand fraternities and I don't understand sororities, so that's on me. Other than that, I think that this book is absolutely revolutionary. It's poignant. It's beautiful to read. It's absolutely heartbreaking, but it's so heartwarming as well. This was a great way to start 2023, and I am going to be thinking about this book for a very, very long time. So if you have any questions, if you understood anything of my rambling, leave it in the comments below. I would love to know what you what you thought of this book. And if you also thought that the grief in this book was so important. If you're interested, all of the references that I used are on my Patreon below. I'm also open for commissions for reviewing books. If you're interested, you can check my Ko-fi, because all of the information is there. You can also check my Ko-fi if you're just willing to buy me a coffee after crying on camera because I miss my grandma, which is not humiliating at all. Anyway, this was today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you guys understood all of my ramblings. And I will see you guys next time. Bye!